Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today, we're looking into sources around a story that, well, on the surface, looks like a terrible accident.
Hmm.
But when you dig into the details, some analyses, they raise some pretty interesting
They
questions.
certainly do.
We're talking about the 2025 Ahmedabad air disaster. And our goal today, really, is to explore those alternative views from the sources, see what they suggest might challenge that official story.
Yeah, sift through the info and see what patterns emerge.
Okay, so let's start with the basics. The established facts, the official line. June 12th, 2025, Air India Flight 171.
Right, a Boeing 7878 Dreamliner. Flying from Ahmedabad, heading to London.
And it was a full flight.
Packed. 242 people, families going on holiday, business travelers, students.
And then just moments after getting airborne.
Yeah, it ran into serious trouble almost immediately. Couldn't climb, seemed to lose control.
And it crashed into a medical college building in Meghananagar, which is pretty built up, right? Not far from the airport.
Exactly, a densely populated area just a few miles out.
The result was just horrific.
Catastrophic is the word. All but one person on the plane died. One survivor out of 242.
Incredible.
And on the ground, the numbers vary slightly, but between 19 and 34 people killed. Many students in that college.
Just awful. So in the immediate aftermath, everyone assumes, okay, tragic accident, something went wrong technically.
That was the global consensus, yeah.
Yeah.
A technical malfunction, just terrible, terrible luck.
A clear story, devastating, but, seemingly straightforward.
Right.
But this is where our deep dive really kicks in, because some of the analyses we've seen, they ask this big question. Was Flight 171 just a random mechanical failure?
Or do some details, some observations in the sources, maybe point to a different read on it, something deliberate.
Yeah, deliberate. And as we look at the information, you start seeing these inconsistencies, these things described as statistical anomalies or long shots.
And they start to make that simple accident theory feel a bit thin.
Okay, let's unpack the first major point raised in these sources.
Right.
This idea of an almost impossible dual-engine failure.
Right. I mean, the Boeing 787 Dreamliner, it's equipped with two extremely reliable, very advanced jet engines.
Pilots train constantly for one engine failing, don't they? And the planes are built to fly perfectly fine on a single engine?
Absolutely. Single-engine operations are standard procedure in training and design. Redundancy is key.
So what's really odd here, according to the sources, is that the investigation seems to be leaning towards both engines failing.
Yes, a dual-engine failure. And not just any time, but during takeoff, the most critical part of the flight.
What are the odds of that, actually?
Astronomically low. For a modern jet like the 787, well-maintained, people throw around numbers like less than 1 in a billion flight hours. Vanishingly rare.
1 in a billion. Wow.
Yeah, and these engines, they have these sophisticated control systems, F-80 full authority, digital engine controls. They're independent, triple redundant computers managing everything.
So for both to fail simultaneously, that bypasses a lot of safety layers.
A monumental failure of the safety architecture, basically.
And it wasn't like these engines were known problems, were they? The sources suggest they were in good shape.
That's what the information indicates. Official logs aren't public, obviously, but word is they had clean records. The right engine apparently was overhauled just 3 months before, March 2025.
Okay.
And the left one wasn't even due for major service until the end of that year. No red flags reported.
So if they were healthy engines, what on earth could cause both to just stop at the same time?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? One really compelling clue, though, suggesting total power loss comes from witnesses.
Right, and there was some phone footage, wasn't there? Grainy, but potentially showing something.
Yeah, exactly. Potentially showing the deployment of the ram air turbine, the RAT.
Ah, the RAT. Explain that quickly for listeners.
Sure, it's basically a small propeller, tucked away usually, that drops down from the plane's belly.
Okay.
Its only job is to spin in the wind and generate emergency power, either electrical or hydraulic. Sometimes both, but only when both main engines are completely dead.
So it's the absolute last resort, if that thing was out.
It signifies a total catastrophic loss of primary power. Game over for the engines.
Have other explanations been floated? I think I saw something about the landing gear.
Yeah, some analyses looked into whether the gear failing to retract could have caused extra drag, putting strain on the systems.
But could that realistically kill two perfectly healthy engines at the same time?
Well, the aviation experts cited in our sources seem pretty perplexed by that idea. It just doesn't seem sufficient to cause a simultaneous dual failure.
Right. It feels off.
It does. It leads some analysts to wonder, Was this a cascade of unrelated failures? Or does it point to something more like a single systemic shutdown, something that just defies the odds?
Okay, let's pivot to the next really striking element, the lone survivor.
Yeah, this is another point that just stands out starkly.
I mean, in a crash that killed over 260 people on the plane, on the ground, one person survives.
One person, a passenger in seat 11A. Reports say they escaped through a break in the fuselage near an emergency exit. Suffered serious injuries, obviously, but survived.
It's described as miraculous, and frankly, it sounds like it.
Absolutely. The forces in a crash like that, especially with the fire afterwards, finding an escape route in seconds seems incredibly improbable.
Was seat 11A significant?
It was near an exit, yeah. That undoubtedly was the key factor in their survival. Pure luck of location, perhaps.
But, and this is where some analyses get uncomfortable.
Right. It raises a question, however speculative.
Mhm.
If, and it's a huge if, an event like this was somehow engineered.
Could a specific part of the plane be targeted or compromised in a way that just might create a small, survivable space near an exit?
It's a chilling thought. And let's be crystal clear here.
Absolutely. No suspicion whatsoever on the survivor. They went through hell.
Exactly. This is purely about questioning the physics and probabilities of the event itself, when you already have this pileup of statistical long shots.
Like the dual engine failure.
Right. This miracle survival, as some sources frame it, just adds another layer that demands a closer look. Was it pure random chance?
Or maybe an unintended consequence of how the plane failed or came apart. Not random luck, but maybe a side effect of something else.
It's a possibility that gets raised when trying to make sense of all the improbable elements together.
Okay, and then there's the crash site, the specific location. Some sources actually call it the chosen target.
Which sounds dramatic, but let's unpack why they might say that.
The logical, official-sounding explanation makes sense initially, right? Pilots in an emergency, low altitude, trying desperately to get back to the airport.
And they lose control and, tragically, hit the first populated thing in their path, in this case, the medical college. Makes sense on paper.
But the alternative view presented in some analyses is, what if that location wasn't just bad luck? What if it wasn't accidental?
Yeah, think about it. Ahmedabad's a huge city. There's lots of variation in population density around the airport fields, industrial areas, residential zones.
But the plane didn't just fall out of the sky into, say, an empty field nearby.
No. It seems it stayed airborne for a few more crucial moments, long enough to travel those few miles and hit specifically a multi-story medical college.
A building known to be packed with people, with students.
Which inevitably maximized the casualties, maximized the horror, and ensured it was a huge international news story.
So the question becomes, could a plane that's lost both engines, even with the RAT providing minimal power,
Minimal hydraulic power, yeah, which gives some basic flight control.
could it still be steered, even crudely, pointed towards a specific area for that short period before impact?
That's the unsettling question some sources are asking. Is it possible? Aviation experts might debate the degree of control, but the choice of target if it was a choice.
It makes the crash site seem less like a random point where control was lost and more like, well, a destination pick for maximum impact.
Again, contrasting the official tragic consequence view with this alternative interpretation that sees the location itself as another suspicious piece of the puzzle.
Right. So let's pull these threads together. We've got the dual engine failure, incredibly rare.
Okay.
We've got the lone survivor, another statistical miracle.
Check.
And we've got the crash site, devastatingly specific, maximizing casualties.
Check.
Now, individually, you can try to explain each one away, right? A 1 in a billion fluke, a miracle, a terrible consequence of losing control over a city.
That's the easy path, the accident narrative. Each piece is improbable, but maybe, just maybe, they all happen together by sheer bad luck.
But some sources argue strongly when you lay these pieces out side by side, that coincidence theory starts to feel really strained, doesn't it?
It really does. The collective pattern is what's striking. A catastrophic failure of ultra-reliable engines.
One person walking away from an unsurvivable inferno.
And an impact point that seems almost strategically chosen for maximum loss of life.
When you put it all together like that.
It starts to feel less random, according to these analyses. It
Yeah.
feels more patterned, more
Yeah.
deliberate, maybe coordinated.
Which leads to that big question some are asking about the investigation itself. If they're laser focused on finding a broken part, a faulty wire, a mechanical cause.
Are they potentially looking for the wrong thing entirely?
Right.
What if the root cause wasn't mechanical at all?
And that brings us to the really provocative theory, The one officials are unlikely talking about publicly.
Right, the theory of a small, sophisticated attack.
Not a big bomb that leaves obvious traces, but something subtler.
Exactly. Think a small, advanced piece of hardware, or maybe even malicious software, a cyber attack vector.
How that even work?
Well, the idea explored in some sources is that such a device or code could potentially interface with the plane's complex electronic systems, maybe via a diagnostic port, maybe exploiting a software vulnerability.
And it could do what? Tell the engines to shut down.
Theoretically, yes. It could potentially issue commands to shut off fuel flow or disrupt the electronic controls, the FEDs we mentioned, essentially ordering a total engine shutdown. And if that were possible, it would neatly explain the exact scenario we saw with Flight 171, wouldn't it?
It would. The sudden, total power loss. No warning signs beforehand.
And it would explain why investigators might be scratching their heads, struggling to find that single, clear, mechanical smoking gun in the wreckage. There might not be one.
So this theory, if you entertain it, it just flips the whole narrative.
Completely. It reframes the crash. Not an accident, but potentially an assassination or an act of mass murder.
Designed specifically to look like a technical problem.
Precisely.
Yeah.
And the evidence for this, as these sources argue, isn't necessarily in the twisted metal. It's in the sheer statistical improbability of the event itself, the pattern.
Okay. So wrapping up this deep dive into the sources on Air India 171, we're left with this fundamental question. What really happened?
Was it that 1 in a billion tragic accident, the confluence of multiple terrible flukes?
Which is what we'll likely hear officially, eventually.
Probably.
Yeah.
Or do these clues we've discussed, the impossible engine failure, the miracle survivor, that devastatingly precise crash site, do they point somewhere darker?
Do they add up to just coincidence? Or do they, as some analyses suggest, look more like the blueprint for something coordinated, something sinister?
The official investigation is still ongoing, of course. A final report could be months, maybe even years away.
But the questions raised by these sources, they hang in the air, don't they?
They do. Like, what critical evidence might be getting missed if the focus is solely on finding a mechanical fault?
And it leaves you, the listener, to think. If it wasn't an accident, what does that imply? What piece of this puzzle seems most compelling or most disturbing to you?
The full truth. Well, it feels like it's still out there, somewhere.